It began on a warm Saturday morning, the kind that hums with the soft rhythm of sprinklers and the distant buzz of lawnmowers. The sun was barely rising over the suburban rooftops when the first sign of trouble appeared, a folded letter taped neatly to the front door. It was printed on thick paper, the kind that feels more official than it really is, and at the top, in bold serif letters, were the words Notice of Violation, Community Standards Enforcement. The house sat on the corner of a quiet cul-de-sac, a modest home with white siding, blue shutters, and a front yard that had once been like every other on the block, sterile, manicured, and predictable. But a few months earlier, that changed. Rows of tomatoes now lined the walkway, herbs filled raised planters near the porch, and a patch of sweet corn swayed gently in the back corner of the lot. The air was thick with the scent of rosemary and soil. What had once been a plain yard was now a thriving little garden, alive, vibrant, and unapologetically green. The letter, however, made it clear that the Homeowners Association did not approve. The words were sharp and impersonal, written in the clipped, bureaucratic tone of someone who had drafted 1,000 such notices before. It declared that the garden was non-compliant with HOA aesthetic regulations, citing a clause buried deep in the association's handbook. Lawns must be kept in a uniform appearance consistent with community standards. Failure to correct the issue within 14 days would result in escalating fines. It was signed, of course, by Elaine Patterson, HOA president. Elaine was infamous in the neighborhood. Her name was spoken in low, exasperated tones during driveway chats and whispered over fences. She was the self-appointed guardian of suburban perfection, the kind of person who measured her worth in property values and paint swatches. To her, the garden was not a patch of sustainability or beauty. It was defiance, disorder, rebellion against the pristine sameness she worked so hard to enforce. The homeowner, a quiet, patient soul who preferred compost to confrontation, had known there might be friction. But the garden was more than decoration. It was a small act of independence, a way to grow food and reconnect with the earth. And, ironically, it was part of a local initiative promoting sustainable green spaces in residential areas. There was even a city incentive program for residents who planted native or edible vegetation to reduce water usage. Still, the HOA didn't care about incentives. They cared about appearances. Over the next week, the tension escalated in subtle, creeping ways. A few neighbors, sympathetic but cautious, avoided making eye contact when walking by. Others whispered that Elaine had been taking photos, crouched at the edge of the sidewalk, snapping evidence for her next board meeting. A neatly typed agenda soon appeared in everyone's mailbox announcing that unauthorized front yard modifications would be discussed at the upcoming HOA gathering. The homeowner tried to stay calm. They gathered receipts, documentation, even screenshots from the city's sustainability webpage. But Elaine's power was not in reason, it was in persistence. She controlled the board, the newsletter, and, by extension, the narrative. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. This time, it wasn't a warning, it was a fine. The total was modest, but the message was clear: comply or pay. The garden stayed. That's when things turned personal. Neighbors began receiving subtle nudges from Elaine, reminders about community cohesion, about following the rules for everyone's sake. The once friendly wave from across the street turned into a curt nod. One morning, the homeowner noticed the garbage cans had been dragged slightly out of place, a petty but unmistakable act of hostility. And a few days later, a complaint was filed with the city's zoning department, alleging that the garden violated public aesthetic standards. It was a clever move. By involving the city, Elaine likely expected the government to do her bidding, to step in, declare the garden unlawful, and force its removal. But fate has a way of twisting intentions. When the city inspector arrived, clipboard in hand, he didn't come to issue a fine. He came to investigate. The HOA.it started innocently enough. He introduced himself, asked a few questions about the plants, took notes about water drainage and property lines. Then, as he flipped through his paperwork, his brow furrowed. He looked up and asked a curious question, one that would change everything. He wanted to know whether the HOA had applied for a green space compliance permit. The homeowner blinked, confused. What permit? As it turned out, the city had passed a new regulation the previous year, one that required homeowners associations to maintain a minimum percentage of natural, sustainable green spaces within their managed communities. It was part of an environmental initiative aimed at combating heat islands and improving air quality. And while individual residents could opt out, HOAs, as governing entities, had to prove compliance through designated community zones or resident participation. The inspector flipped a few pages on his clipboard again and frowned deeper. He said he hadn't found any record of the HOA submitting their annual report. That wasn't good. The homeowner, still standing among their tomatoes and basil, realized something extraordinary. Elaine, in all her obsession with uniform lawns and aesthetic perfection, might have led her HOA straight into legal noncompliance, and the very garden she hated might be the only thing saving them from it. When the inspector left, he promised to follow up with the HOA board directly. He took photos, not of violations, but of the garden itself, documenting its irrigation efficiency, the native plants, the pollinator-friendly layout. He said it could actually serve as a model for compliance. For the first time in weeks, the homeowner smiled. That evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the garden gold, Elaine appeared again, arms crossed, lips tight, her gaze cutting through the air. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. The hostility was palpable. Somewhere behind those cold, narrowed eyes, she could sense the shift in power, the creeping realization that her campaign might not be going as planned. Inside, the homeowner placed the two HOA letters side by side on the kitchen counter, next to a growing stack of notes and documentation. For the first time, the fear was gone, replaced instead by something steady, deliberate, and unyielding. The quiet strength of someone who knows the truth is on their side. The game had changed. And soon, Elaine would find out just how badly she had overplayed her hand. The next week arrived cloaked in an uneasy calm. The cul-de-sac looked the same, lawns trimmed to military precision, American flags swaying lazily in the breeze, the faint hum of sprinklers soaking grass that no one actually used. But beneath that familiar suburban surface, a quiet ripple of tension spread through the neighborhood. That IT began when the HOA board received a letter of their own, not from a resident, but from the city's Department of Environmental and Land Management. It was a request for compliance verification, a polite but firm document asking the association to provide proof of their adherence to the city's green space ordinance. The letter cited a specific code section, one that required all homeowners associations managing more than 25 parcels to maintain a measurable ratio of natural vegetation and pollinator supportive spaces within the community. For most neighborhoods, this wasn't a problem. Small community gardens, native flower patches near mailboxes, even decorative shrubs could qualify. But this HOA, under Elaine Patterson's leadership, had spent years doing the opposite, stripping out every natural patch, replacing it with synthetic turf, uniform sod, and chemical-treated ornamentals that looked perfect and lifeless. And now, the very rules Elaine prided herself on enforcing were about to become her undoing. The letter demanded documentation within 15 business days. Failure to comply would result in a full city audit, including fines and possible restrictions on HOA operations. It was bureaucratic language, but anyone who'd ever dealt with municipal agencies knew what it really meant. The city was watching now. Word spread fast. Some neighbors whispered about it while walking their dogs. Others gossiped in the community Facebook group. Screenshots of the city's letter floated between residents with quiet fascination. Nobody dared post publicly. Elaine had moderators watching, but the shift was unmistakable. The fear that once surrounded the HOA was starting to crack. Inside her immaculately decorated home, Elaine tried to regain control. She drafted emails, called emergency meetings, and even cornered board members one by one. But the tone of those interactions had changed. The board members, once loyal to her every word, now sounded uncertain. None of them had known about the green space ordinance. None had seen the letter until Elaine reluctantly shared it. The more she tried to minimize the issue, the more it grew. By the end of the week, a city environmental officer named Thomas Avery had been assigned to review the case. He was methodical and courteous, the kind of civil servant who took pride in following procedure. He requested site photos, landscaping records, and maintenance reports for all common areas. What he received was not encouraging. The HOA had no designated green space at all. No shared garden, no native plants, not even a butterfly-friendly flower bed. The landscaping company they'd contracted with for years had been instructed to remove unapproved vegetation regularly. According to the invoices, those removals included volunteer milkweed, wildflowers, and, most ironically, several resident gardens that had been dismantled under Elaine's enforcement. Thomas noted all of it. He didn't issue a ruling yet, but he made one key observation in his report. One property within the association appears to demonstrate compliance with the city's ordinance through its use of edible and native vegetation. That property, of course, was the one Elaine had been trying to find out of existence. Meanwhile, the homeowner remained quiet. They went about their daily routine, watering the tomatoes, trimming basil, harvesting peppers that glowed like lanterns in the sun. But the presence of city officials changed the atmosphere. Inspectors came by for follow-up photos, documenting soil drainage and water usage. They asked permission to take samples, and they measured the temperature differential between the garden area and the adjacent turf lawns. The results were astonishing. The garden soil was cooler by several degrees, and water usage was significantly lower than neighboring properties. These findings went directly into the city's file, and indirectly, into Elaine's undoing. When the next HOA board meeting was held, attendance was unusually high. Residents packed into the small clubhouse, folding chairs lined in tight rows, the air heavy with anticipation. Though the homeowner didn't attend, their garden was the silent centerpiece of every whispered conversation. Elaine opened the meeting as she always did, crisp, controlled, the kind of tone that brooked no dissent. But this time, the murmurs didn't die down. She began with a long explanation about miscommunication with the city, claiming that the green space ordinance didn't apply to their community. She cited outdated language from a years-old version of the municipal code, speaking as though her confidence could rewrite reality. But several residents, having done their own research, weren't convinced. One raised a printed copy of the updated city code. Another quietly mentioned that they'd seen the inspector taking measurements at the garden. Elaine's mask began to slip. Her voice grew sharper, her smile tighter. By the end of the meeting, the board voted to suspend further enforcement actions until the city's review was complete, a polite way of saying that Elaine's authority was on hold. She left the room before adjournment, lips pressed thin, her heels echoing like punctuation marks of frustration against the tile. Over the following days, things grew stranger. The homeowner noticed cars slowing down to look at the garden. A few residents stopped to take photos. One left a note in the mailbox, and signed but kind, thanking them for standing your ground. Another quietly placed a small pot of lavender near the edge of their own lawn. A small act of solidarity, barely noticeable, but meaningful. Then, the inevitable happened. The city scheduled an official inspection of the HOA's common areas. Notices were posted. The date was set. Elaine tried to block it, sending an urgent email claiming the HOA's landscaping company was unavailable for review, but the city's tone was no longer accommodating. The inspection was mandatory. The day of the visit dawned bright and cloudless. The inspectors arrived mid-morning, wearing vests and carrying clipboards, their presence impossible to ignore. They methodically walked through the subdivision, down the uniform streets, past chemically perfect lawns, documenting every synthetic blade of grass. Their notes grew longer with every property. And then, finally, they arrived at the garden. It stood in quiet defiance. Lush, fragrant, alive. Bees danced between blossoms, soil rich and dark beneath their feet. The inspectors didn't speak much, but the way they paused, the way they took their photos carefully, said everything. Later that evening, as the neighborhood settled into its usual silence, Elaine's lights burned late. Her printer whirred, her email alerts chimed, and her phone buzzed with calls from anxious board members. But for all her scrambling, there was nothing she could do now. The city had the data. The compliance report was being written, and the garden, the one she had tried so hard to destroy, was no longer just tolerated. It was evidenced by the end of the week. A thin envelope appeared in every resident's mailbox, this time bearing the city's official seal. The summary was short but powerful. The HOA was non-compliant with municipal green space regulations. A formal correction plan was required within 60 days. Failure to comply could result in substantial fines and a suspension of their operational authority. And at the bottom of the notice, in clear, unambiguous language, the report listed one surprising recommendation. Resident garden at Lot 17 demonstrates full compliance and may serve as a model for future green space development within the association. The balance of power had shifted. Elaine's reign was crumbling, and the neighborhood knew it. But the story wasn't finished yet, because when a cornered HOA president decides to fight back, things can turn ugly before they turn right. The aftermath of the city's ruling rippled through the neighborhood like an unexpected storm. The cul-de-sac, once a portrait of suburban monotony, now felt charged with tension, curiosity, and quiet satisfaction. Every neighbor seemed to move a little differently. Heads held higher, conversations sharper, eyes darting toward the corner lot where the garden thrived like a stubborn jewel. Elaine Patterson was the first to show the strain. She arrived at the next HOA board meeting looking frazzled, her perfectly styled hair slightly out of place, the usual armor of confidence cracked at the edges. Her opening speech, the one she had rehearsed in front of her bathroom mirror, faltered under the weight of reality. She tried to frame the city's report as a misunderstanding, a bureaucratic error, but board members were no longer docile. Some dared to ask questions. Others quietly referenced the city's documentation. For the first time in her tenure, her authority was being openly challenged. The homeowner, still quietly tending their garden, watched the chaos from a distance. They didn't attend the meeting, but news trickled back through sympathetic neighbors. Elaine's complaints and attempts to downplay the situation fell flat. The city's inspectors had already left a clear trail: photos, soil tests, irrigation plans, and compliance notes. The homeowner's garden wasn't just safe, it was praised as exemplary. Word spread fast. Neighbors who had once feared retaliation now felt emboldened. Small acts of defiance began to appear throughout the community. A resident painted a butterfly on their mailbox. Another planted a patch of lavender near the curb. Even children began placing small potted plants on stoops, smiling shyly as adults nodded approvingly. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was unmistakable. The HOA's rigid grip on aesthetic control was slipping. Elaine, meanwhile, became increasingly erratic. Emails to board members grew longer, filled with caps lock warnings and lists of grievances. She threatened legal action, referencing clauses buried deep in HOA contracts that she assumed no one had ever read. Board members, however, were hesitant. Some whispered that consulting a lawyer might cost more than any fines from the city. Others quietly admitted that even if they wanted to fight, the city's report left little room for maneuver. The homeowner, despite being the focal point of this upheaval, remained remarkably calm. Each morning, they tended their vegetables, rotated their compost, and pruned herbs with careful precision. The garden thrived under sunlight and careful attention, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding across the street. Bees buzzed lazily between blossoms. Tomatoes ripened in the warm sun. Corn stalks swayed in gentle rhythm. Life continued, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniably victorious. The city soon followed up with a formal notice to the HOA. It was concise and unambiguous. The board was required to submit a corrective plan detailing how they would achieve compliance with green space regulations. The letter emphasized collaboration, not punishment, but it carried an unmistakable undertone. Noncompliance would have real consequences, including fines that could reach tens of thousands of dollars and the suspension of HOA operational authority. For Elaine, the notice was catastrophic. The neighbors, emboldened by the city's involvement, began openly discussing their dissatisfaction with her leadership. Some questioned past enforcement actions, pointing out instances where personal preference had been enforced as community standard. Others spoke quietly about the long-term impact of her rigid approach, how it had sown fear and resentment. The turning point came when the HOA board met privately, without Elaine present. They discussed the city's directive with practical, rational voices, something Elaine had rarely invited. A vote was taken. The HOA would comply, slowly and methodically, creating designated green spaces, allowing residents to maintain gardens, and reevaluating rules that restricted native or edible plants. Elaine had been sidelined, her influence diminished, and the board quietly recognized that continued confrontation would only result in further legal and financial exposure. Meanwhile, the homeowner continued to reap the benefits of perseverance. Their garden became a symbol in the community, a quiet but potent reminder that individual initiative could challenge entrenched authority. Neighbors who had once hesitated to plant anything beyond grass now began experimenting with flowers, herbs, and small vegetable plots. The cul-de-sac, once uniform and sterile, slowly became a patchwork of personal expression, vibrant color, and sustainable living. Local media caught wind of the story. A small city newspaper ran a piece highlighting the homeowner's garden as an example of successful urban sustainability. Social media posts praising the garden went viral within the city, attracting comments from residents in other neighborhoods seeking inspiration. The narrative was clear. One individual had stood up to an overbearing HOA president and won, not with confrontation, but with persistence, documentation, and adherence to the law. Elaine, for her part, retreated into silence. Her attempts to regain control were increasingly ignored. Emails went unanswered. Board members politely but firmly enforced the new green space policies. Even the HOA newsletter, once her personal megaphone, now contained disclaimers reminding members of city regulations and encouraging collaboration with sustainable initiatives. The homeowner never sought recognition. They simply continued tending their garden, harvesting vegetables, planting flowers, and nurturing pollinators. Their yard remained a calm oasis amid the simmering social tension, a living testament to patience, resilience, and the quiet power of doing what's right. As weeks turned to months, the neighborhood transformed. Gardens flourished. Streets that had once been indistinguishable became uniquely expressive. Community events began to incorporate plant swaps and compost workshops. Children learned about pollinators, neighbors shared seeds and stories, and the HOA, now humbled, found itself functioning more as a facilitator than a dictator. And somewhere, quietly but unmistakably, the city's involvement had cemented a simple truth. Authority can be challenged, but the law, reason, and a little courage will often prevail. The homeowner looked out at the garden one evening, sun low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the rows of vegetables and herbs. Bees hummed lazily, leaves rustled gently in the breeze, and the scent of fresh soil mingled with blooming flowers. For all the conflict, all the letters, inspections, and threats the garden had endured, it wasn't just a victory over the HOA. It was a victory for the neighborhood, for community, and for the small but persistent forces of nature and law working in tandem. That Elaine's reign of rigid control had ended, not with a dramatic showdown, but with quiet inevitability. And the garden, once labeled unsightly and non-compliant, now stood as proof that persistence, documentation, and the courage to stand one's ground could turn the tables on even the most entrenched authority. Life returned to its natural rhythm. The cul-de-sac, once silent under the weight of fear and perfectionism, now thrived in color, fragrance, and movement. And the homeowner, still tending their garden, finally felt the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served, not through anger or confrontation, but through patience, preparation, and the quiet assertion of what was right. The garden had won.